So one of the newest features to come alongside patch 13.5 was the introduction of containers in the game having potential random spawns across the map. Basically, the idea behind it was trying to break the monotony of always knowing exactly where loot spawns on a given map and giving that idea a shake-up. I suppose BSG wasn't a fan of the Jaeger stash running meta, and that was ultimately the catalyst for this change to not only those stashes, but most containers in the game, with a few exceptions. Initially, I was very indifferent about containers being chalked up to more RNG in Tarkov, but after some more time just playing the game and experiencing those kinds of looting moments, both where you find no containers where there normally are, and times where there's more than one than what's normally there, I think it's a net positive as a whole. But other than to just run stashes, I suppose my main question to this change is still, why? I'm gonna read straight from the patch notes where it talks about the change to containers. It reads, quote, "Containers will now spawn at random points. The number of spawn points for containers has been increased on all locations. Large wooden crates, some Terra Group crates, large cash registers, and filing cabinets will now always spawn at their respective locations." When you look at the patch notes and read the change out loud, it's a little vague about what it's actually doing. It gets the point across concisely, but the first question I asked myself when I read that change was, what containers is this going to affect? Whether or not the vagueness was intentional, we don't know, but after playing for some time, I have noticed the addition and removal of certain containers across a handful of maps in the game. Obviously customs, where for the most part I find more boxes to loot than not, which is a good thing. Plenty of places have 2 boxes most of the time instead of 1 or 0. It's certainly a breath of fresh air to see more loot in the game that can be found by looting crates, but it also goes beyond just the weapon crates themselves. I've also noticed a ton of extra duffel bags around, which is awesome. Interchange has a lot of sneaky ones inside of shelves. Ollie was fun to look around on as a scav. I managed to find about 3 different extra duffel bags that I don't think were there previously. I could certainly be wrong, but being in Ollie enough times for the early interchange quests, that part of the mall I feel I'm the most familiar with. But some other highlights I've noticed are 2 gray weapon containers in the building adjacent to the power switch building on customs. Most of the time I can loot those 2 containers and have no problem, and I've only had 1 raid so far where there was nothing there at all. So again, it feels like it was an overall net positive where most of the time you will be getting the same, if not more loot than you were previously. You can still come across rooms with no containers, of course, it's bound to happen, it's RNG. But perhaps BSG leaned into giving the maps more loot instead of less loot for most of the time in these situations. The most interesting part of this change by far, however, was how it affected Jaeger stashes. Now this might be a bug, but it seems like for a short spell right after the wipe happened, there were no stashes spawning on either woods or interchange. But again, this might have been a bug that has been fixed because when I initially heard that from people, custom stashes were not only working, but were always in the exact same spot and always up. Sometimes they didn't spawn, so it's definitely working as intended on BSG's end for that map. So this might be some new patch growing pains that BSG is cleaning up behind the scenes. But apparently the stashes were the initial idea to adjust how most loot containers work in this game. Initially, my opinion on this whole thing was kind of non-existent, if that even makes sense. On one hand, I thought, okay, cool, we sometimes get more loot, that's awesome. That'll make for a more pleasant looting experience both on your PMC and your scav. You might be able to find some containers others missed and get some dope loot. And on the other hand, my brain went, why would you need to randomize the containers in the game? There's already enough of them across the maps, so it feels redundant to make the looting opportunities less on the maps. I initially compared it to dynamic loot that happened a couple years ago, where stuff can kind of just be laying around minding its own business on shelves or on the floor, things you can actually see with your own eyes. But it's gotten better over time, and items spawning in the world more often just makes more sense. And having containers move around and sometimes be there and not be there is interesting. The one thing BSG wants to directly address with this change has been hit, which again is Jaeger stash runs. You can run your stash and loot routes on maps, but whether they yield any results is down to more Tarkov RNG. Which, I mean, is there an argument to be made for RNG elements in a game already littered with them? Yeah, but hey, if this is how they wanted to handle loot boxes, who am I going to complain with? Either way, we are still only a little over a week into the wipe. I'm sure BSG is paying very close attention to how people are engaging and talking about random containers in the game. This is something I feel as though they will be trying to constantly improve, and I personally have only scratched the surface with some locations where there is a high concentration of loot. Shoreline, Reserve, Lighthouse, I'm sure these maps might vastly improve from random loot, so we will have to play more and just see for ourselves. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. If you have your own thoughts on random loot containers in Tarkov being a good or a bad thing, be sure to leave a comment down below and subscribe for more videos about the subtle changes that we will discover across Tarkov as a whole. I hope to see you in future ones.